Hi, I'm Bart Welling from the University of North Florida, and I'm going to be presenting some ideas from my book I'm working on called No Blood for Oil, Rethinking Energy, Re-inhabiting the Modern World. And I tried to squeeze a lot into this paper, so I hope everyone can keep up. But for years, peak oil writers and activists have been warning that the depletion of the world's petroleum reserves could produce worldwide economic and social upheavals. Global warming has greatly complicated the nightmare of our dependence on petroleum, as author Benjamin Kunkel frames it. To paraphrase Kunkel, the problem is no longer merely that we may run out of oil, the problem is also that we may not. Most of the oil, coal, and natural gas that currently remains in the ground, including approximately 85% of Canada's giant bitumen reserves, for instance, according to a 2015 study, must never be extracted if we want to keep the Earth's temperature from rising to catastrophic levels. Clearly, the situation demands that we redefine oil and other fossil fuels, that we learn to stop thinking of them as fuels to begin with. Writers, filmmakers, and scholars in the humanities will have a crucial role to play in this difficult process. Science can tell us many things about hydrocarbons' relationship with global warming, but science's capacity to deal with our current predicament is obviously limited, not least of all because the problem is only partly scientific in nature. The idea of hydrocarbons as energy depends at least as much on mythic assumptions about humanity's rightful place in the world as it does on chemical formulas and computer models. This paper explores the power of literary, visual, and larger cultural narratives to de-energize, replace, and restore hydrocarbons, and by the same token to help humanity repartner with hydrocarbons and with the sun, the wind, and other renewable energy sources, not just in the name of carbon neutrality, but with a more equitable and fulfilling future in mind. Admittedly, transitioning away from hydrocarbons as an energy source is going to be an enormous and mostly unprecedented challenge. Given the depth of our dependence on these non-renewable substances and the vast scale and number of problems associated with the hydrocarbon economy's just as evil twin, global warming, there are no guarantees that some dire predictions of resource wars, economic collapse, and massive human die-offs will not come true. Nevertheless, we can take comfort from the fact that people have been living in partnerships with natural forces and non-human beings for far longer than they have been commodifying coal and oil and using petroleum distillates and natural gas as fuel for vehicles and feedstock for plastics. Likewise, it is good to remember that many different cultures used hydrocarbons for thousands of years without causing too much long-term ecological damage. In fact, up until quite recently, in historical terms, petroleum and other hydrocarbons were used locally and regionally in relatively small quantities, not as a fuel for vehicles and power plants, but for a wide range of other purposes, as an adhesive and building material, for waterproofing baskets and boats, in cosmetics and drugs, as a weapon, e.g. the Byzantine Empire's dreaded Greek fire, and even for mummifying Egyptian corpses. Dangerously volatile liquid hydrocarbons could only be obtained from underground and underwater seeps over which humans had little control. Not surprisingly, petroleum seeps and associated gas vents in fires were often linked with sacred powers and mythic events. The hydrocarbon-soaked Afsharon Peninsula, now part of Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea, dubbed the region of the eternal fire by one British journalist thanks to its spontaneously burning gas flares, attracted Zoroastrian and Hindu worshippers for centuries. One still extant fire temple near Baku was built to channel natural gas to a central altar and up to the four corners of the roof of a shrine where the gas could blaze more or less forever. But even minor hydrocarbon deposits, such as outcroppings of oil shale near Seefeld, Austria, could generate their own mythologies. For example, historian R.J. Forbes recounts an Austrian legend explaining that the oil obtained by heating Seefeld's stinking stone originally came from the body of a giant named Thyrsis, who, as he lay bleeding to death from wounds inflicted by another giant, commanded his magical blood to go help beasts and mankind. Surprisingly, Tirsenblut, the blood of Thyrsis, like other varieties of petroleum, was prized for centuries for its supposed medicinal properties. As hydrocarbons morphed into major commodities in the form of fuels, their relationships both to their places of origin and to narrative changed dramatically. For instance, 19th century American railroad boosters frequently crowed about how steam trains were joining technologies like the telegraph in annihilating space and time. That's a very commonly used stock phrase. And in the early 20th century, automobiles took this godlike power a step further by coupling the speed of the coal-powered train with the intoxicating freedom of a privately owned vehicle that could, theoretically anyway, use any road at any time rather than being confined to a set of fixed tracks and rigid schedules. With the mid-20th century advent of international jet air travel and the space race, not to mention the spread of centralized heating and air cooling systems, electric refrigerators, personal computers, and the internet, and countless other hydrocarbon-dependent technologies, with the spread of these things, the relationships between hydrocarbons and their sites of origin and processing, as well as the places impacted by burning them, seemed to have been annihilated just as definitively as space and time. To see how effectively fossil fuel corporations have defaced hydrocarbons, simply pay a visit to any gas station or watch any of these corporations' TV commercials. Perhaps one day the corporations will try to cash in on consumer demand for sustainable goods by selling fair trade and all-natural oil products and coal, but for now the emphasis is decidedly on clean, sourceless, harmless, inexhaustible, indispensable, infinitely powerful energy. Unlike dirty fossil fuels, energy can never run out, pollute a watershed, corrupt a politician, change the climate, or poison a child. When it becomes impossible to ignore where hydrocarbons come from and the impact they have on actual places, as it did in the wake of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon blowout, the fossil fuels industry has many tools with which it can distract consumers' and governments' attention from the true amount of damage being done to the places in question. During the 2010 Gulf of Mexico spill, BP spent tens of millions of dollars trying to persuade angry Gulf Coast residents and others that they would, quote, get this done and make this right. Much more insidiously, BP employed over 1 million gallons of a material semiotic construct in the form of a toxic oil dispersant with the Orwellian name of Corexit, which did not correct the spill so much as hide it from view by dragging much of the crude oil down into the water column. And the fossil fuels industry has worked just as hard to obscure hydrocarbons' downstream relationships with place in the form of global warming as it has labored to conceal the true upstream costs of extraction. For instance, as Naomi Klein observes in This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, ExxonMobil and other corporations have been major funders of such promoters of climate denialism as the Heartland Institute. Of course, in moments of crisis, it becomes easier to attain some critical distance from the sacrificial logic through which people's lives and livelihoods, the places they inhabit, and the lives of the non-human beings with whom they share these places are materially and semiotically traded for energy. Oil became literally and imaginatively replaced, for example, as tar balls washed up on the popular Gulf of Mexico beaches after the 2010 blowout. The Gulf lost much of its invisibility as a hydrocarbon sacrifice zone, despite BP's best efforts, as angry Gulf residents tallied up their losses on national TV news shows and as images of oiled birds and dead turtles proliferated online. As effective as these apocalyptic images were in channeling public outrage towards BP, Stephanie Limenager is right that the, quote, BP explosion has not spurred Americans to reconsider loving oil. Nor have any number of other disasters involving oil, coal, and gas sparked lasting mainstream recognition of the incalculably worse results of carrying on with business as usual, the normal, non-catastrophic production and burning of fossil fuels. We need new, non-apocalyptic stories that address a much larger systemic catastrophe that is driven not just by corporate greed and the evils of capitalism, but by an entirely understandable desire on the part of everyday people to enjoy longer, more comfortable, and more expansive lives than those of our ancestors. I say new stories, but it would be more appropriate, borrowing a term from bioregional thinking, to call these narratives re-inhabitory, since they are grounded, I believe, in values far older than the unsustainable and fundamentally dishonest guiding principles of petro-modernity, and since they revolve around a much more basic and enduring human concern than the need for speed and the equivocal pleasures of drive-through living. The concern I have in mind is the love of place. In This Changes Everything, Klein identifies a, quote, ferocious love of particular places and place-centered cultures as the defining feature of Leucadia, the name by which she and others refer to a, quote, roving transnational conflict zone that is cropping up with increasing frequency and intensity wherever extractive projects are attempting to dig and drill, whether for open-pit mines or gas fracking or tar sands oil pipelines. But Blockadia isn't just committed to disrupting plans to extract and transport fossil fuels. Klein provides numerous heartening accounts of how activists and entrepreneurs like the Lakota solar energy pioneer Henry Red Cloud are countering the rootless logic of extractivism with projects that are attuned to the social as well as topographical idiosyncrasies of particular places, and that are dedicated to cultural renewal as much as they are to environmental sustainability. In addition to planting trees and installing solar panels, bioregionalists challenge extractivism by using something that I have referred to elsewhere as re-inhabitory discourse. This creative use and reuse of language is invested in describing the processes of re-inhabitation, which could entail either moving to and restoring an abused and abandoned place or finding more conscious and sustainable ways to live in the place where we already dwell. So it's a descriptive type of discourse, but it also actively participates in bioregional processes in projects by rehabilitating older discourses that have shaped culture's attitudes towards and experiences of their home bioregions. Henry Red Cloud uses re-inhabitory discourse to frame 21st century technologies as outgrowths of, rather than modern alternatives to, ancient worldviews when he argues that, quote, solar power was always part of natives' way of life, and here I'm going to do my best, forgive me. Everything followed the Anpetue Tawanawaka, the life-giving force of the sun. It ties in with our culture, our ceremony, our language, our songs. According to Klein, Red Cloud teaches the students who come to his renewable energy school on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota that the effort to help Native American move from fossil fuels to solar power is about, quote, what the ancestors shed blood for, always fought for, the earth. Red Cloud's goal is not just to train technicians, but to create, quote, solar warriors. Of course, if everyone on Earth were to join the ranks of Red Cloud's solar army, global warming would quickly become a more manageable problem than it is today. But re-inhabitory discourse, like more tangible forms of re-inhabitation, necessarily varies from culture to culture and from bioregion to bioregion. Henry Red Cloud's message appeals greatly to descendants of warrior cultures who have fought hard to survive in the modern petro world. But what about people in the proverbial belly of the beast, members of the extractivist culture that both tried to annihilate Red Cloud's ancestors and invented petro-modernity? In particular, given the supercharged and highly disunified state of American politics, what forms of re-inhabitory discourse might be able to take root in places like rural, predominantly white communities in the U.S., where global warming skepticism and anti-government sentiment run high, and where tens of thousands of people depend on the hydrocarbons industry and related economic sectors for their livelihoods, despite frequent reminders in the form of air and water pollution, political corruption, cancer clusters, destruction of wetlands, constant noise, and much more of the incalculable larger costs of cheap energy. And what about the tens of millions of suburban consumers who have largely been sheltered from exposure to these costs and whose predisposition to care about place has been compromised going back multiple generations by lifelong residents in the non-places and place-transcending narratives of autopia? Do we simply need to trash discourses like the myths that turn hydrocarbons into energy and knock down the subdivisions and the freeways, or could these narratives and non-places somehow be re-inhabited? Some provisional but encouraging answers to questions like these have begun to emerge in recent environmental writing, place-centered visual culture, and eco-criticism. Perhaps the first lesson to be drawn from this work is that petrocritics of every variety should be willing to situate themselves in their own petrocultures, providing an as honest as possible reckoning of what they owe to hydrocarbons before they can persuade anyone else to rethink fossil fuels. Owning up to our addiction to hydrocarbons, destructive attachment, bad love, as Stephanie Limonasher puts it, could conceivably result in paralyzing guilt. But a more likely outcome, as seen many times in Limonasher's book, is that the struggle to, quote, keep an honest ledger sheet, and that's from a book by David Gessner, can open up surprising opportunities for re-inhabitory conversations with people we may have ignored in the past as potential allies, particularly when we share a concern about place with them. Limonasher begins Living Oil with a prologue in which she explores her family's investments in the oil industry, noting that while she, quote, spends a good deal of time disagreeing with her father, a part-time oil man who waxes poetic about the Tea Party, he is the only member of the family who reads her work, eager to criticize and debate. Living Oil ends with a literal ledger sheet in the form of a life cycle assessment, in which the book owns up precisely to its situatedness, not just as discourse in the usual critical and socio-economic contexts, but as an energy-dependent physical object in the biosphere. Between the prologue and the life cycle assessment, Le Ménage's spilled book, as she calls it, is full of moments in which Le Ménage physically re-inhabits places, the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, Fort McMurray, Alberta, the epicenter of Canadian bitumen mining. She re-inhabits them in the sense that she inhabits them in ways that transgress the reigning logics of petro-modernity, e.g. by walking instead of driving, by scrutinizing infrastructure that was basically designed to be ignored. Le Ménage also re-inhabits academic and popular discourses, in part by marrying her scholarly procedures with non-scholarly dialogue. An email exchange with an ex-convict poet here, a conversation with a taxi driver there. David Gessner's re-inhabitory project in his book, The Tarball Chronicles, A Journey Beyond the Oiled Pelican and Into the Heart of the Gulf Oil Spill, centers on the same kind of dialogue. One of the unlikely heroes of the Tarball Chronicles is Ryan Lambert, the salt-of-the-earth conservative owner of a hunting and fishing lodge and guide service called Cajun Fishing Adventures. While I watch birds through binoculars, Gessner observes, he likes to shoot them. But Gessner comes to admire Lambert's deep knowledge of the Louisiana wetlands and waters he has hunted and fished since childhood, and he celebrates Lambert's boundless energy as exemplified by his 21-year day and night efforts to save enough money to start his business, as well as by Lambert's, quote, angry determination to begin again after Hurricane Katrina nearly destroyed his lodge. In fact, Lambert's energy, along with a similar sense of drivenness that Gessner identifies in people like Cape Cod wind energy entrepreneur Jim Gordon, becomes Gessner's greatest answer to oil. After describing one of Lambert's impromptu speeches about the need to restore Louisiana's ravaged wetlands, Gessner writes, I love Ryan's description of the way energy shimmers off the marsh in waves, and I also love the way it shimmers off the most motivated and driven people. I am energized by obsessed people like Ryan who manage to unite a wild personal energy, an energy beyond reason, with a love of what they have found here on Earth. Running into someone like Ryan is reassuring in the face of a larger hopelessness. It's good to know that if we're going down, at least we'll go down fighting. A Massachusetts native and North Carolina transplant, Gessner never re-inhabits the Gulf by moving there permanently or by pretending to be something more than a concerned outsider. Rather, much of his bioregional work consists of re-inhabiting both the unpopular environmentalist discourse of sacrifice and the conservative corporate discourse of energy, comprising ideas of self-interest, growth, hard work, and entrepreneurship. He re-inhabits both of these discourses in an effort to show how we can take, quote, some of our restlessness and energy and put it to better uses, guided not just by the desire for ease, but also by older ideals of sacrifice, of good work and growth, and wildness beyond an engineer's dream of straight lines. Gessner's work does involve explicitly rejecting the corporate and governmental definition of sacrifice, as in sacrifice zones on the one hand, and eco-apocalyptic thinking and the notion of fundamentally altering humanity's restless, self-interested nature on the other hand. But re-inhabitory discourse is an art more of dialogue, synthesis, and responsibility than of renunciation. Gessner wants to move beyond traditional socio-political dichotomies as he envisions a viable future without much oil. Significantly, re-inhabitory discourse can also be playful and beautiful, as shown by Gessner's sly but poetic re-inhabitation of Chevron's human energy slogan in the passage cited above. Fossil fuel corporations and their allies among the ranks of cornucopian academics like to argue that human energy in the form of market-driven ingenuity will be able to overcome any natural limit, especially the constraints imposed on human societies by declining hydrocarbon supplies and global warming. Gessner's thoughts on energy beyond reason may seem to echo this kind of irrational optimism, but his book actually tries to remarry reason with older ways of knowing the world, and to promote a definition of energy based on human immanence in and cooperation with natural forces like sunlight, wind, and immensely powerful ocean tides, rather than on suicidal and world-transcending visions of transcendence. World-destroying visions of transcendence. This is what environmental historian Carolyn Merchant means by a, quote, partnership ethic, a synthesis between an ecological approach based on moral consideration for all living and non-living things, and a human-centered approach based on the social good and the fulfillment of basic human needs. Now, if all of this seems like wishful thinking, We can take some comfort not just from the example of countries like Iceland and Germany that are transitioning with a remarkable degree of success to renewable energy, but from the tremendous re-inhabitory power of non-human life forms, from oysters and petroleum-eating microbes to lowly species of beach grass that have evolved to partner with the forces of sun, wind, and water instead of trying to transcend them, and can slowly, collaboratively build structures far more resilient than our strongest buildings. A.R. Ammons's poem Dunes, which talks about beach grass, can be viewed as an ars poetica, a meditation, say, on the challenges inherent in writing in the windy and sandy wordscapes of free verse compared to the firmer ground of traditional poetry. But it can also be read as a parable of how earth-oriented critics and bioregionalists can think and act in the loose world of shifting coastlines and shrinking economies that we have just begun to enter. And the poem reads, "Taking root in windy sand is not an easy way to go about finding a place to stay. A ditch bank or wood's edge has firmer ground. In a loose world, though, something can be started. A root touch water, a tip break sand. Mounds from that can rise on held mounds. A gesture of building, keeping, a trapping into shape. Firm ground is not available ground." Indeed, something can be started, and it is being started in myriad unlikely places, from vacant lot gardens in the Motor City to a former concrete wasteland under a freeway overpass in my town, Jacksonville, Florida, now home to a thriving weekly arts and farmers market. New mounds of viable life-place culture are rising on held mounds of old place-based traditions that have managed to survive the onslaughts of petro-modernity. And in some cases, these cultures are growing on bare sand where bioregional traditions vanished long ago. Gestures of building and keeping, including the writing and study of imaginative literature, are not necessarily mere gestures in the colloquial sense. Bioregional theorist Robert L. Thayer Jr. makes just as strong an argument for the importance of bioregional art, dreams, and rituals of place attachment as he does for reinvigorating local economies and restoring remaining patches of wilderness in the Sacramento Valley of California. In fact, Thayer would probably agree that the dunes Ammons is describing and the kinds of life places we would like to inhabit cannot exist without the kind of material semiotic gesture that Ammons is describing and making in the poem. In particular, the world desperately needs new, non-apocalyptic visions of a post-hydrocarbon future to build on. But we cannot merely counter dystopian narratives with utopian schemes, or keep pretending in the fine ivory tower tradition of ignoring our work's situatedness in bioregional terms, as well as its ecological costs, that we are somehow above the fray. Ammons's last line, which serves as an epigraph to Gessner's book, offers 21st century re-inhabitants three crucial insights all in one. A note of caution regarding where we actually stand, as opposed to where we wish we stood. An unsentimental requiem for the world that existed before petro-modernity, or at least for false visions of that world, in global warming. And third, an admonition to start the work of rebuilding our culture now, while we at least have some sand left to build on. Firm ground is not available ground. Like it or not, human relationships with hydrocarbons have created a worldwide mess, and we will not get far if we do not begin by acknowledging, following Gessner, that all of us, humans and non-humans, eco-critics and Exxon CEOs, are going to be, quote, part of this mess forever. Thank you.